everyone. I'm Dr. Thea Gallagher, the clinical director of Cobalt, and I'm here with Dr. Phil Gehrman. And do you want to introduce yourself, Phil?
Sure. I'm a clinical psychologist and associate professor here in the Department of Psychiatry, specializing in the treatment of sleep disorders.
Wonderful. Well, today we're going to really touch down on sleep and try to unpack some of the questions that many of us have been asking, or as therapists or healthcare professionals have been hearing about. So, one thing I think that we're all seeing a lot of, is that sleep in times of COVID and the pandemic has been really bad. And so what are your thoughts on why sleep, is being impacted more than ever right now?
Sure. I mean, certainly the number one reason is just because of stress. When people are under stress, sleep is often one of the first things that's affected. And these certainly have been stressful times. I think also just being stuck inside for long periods of time, we're not getting, having our normal routines, kind of not getting outside for a lot of sunlight, because lower activities overall, that seems to be contributing to the sleep problems as well.
And, why is sleep so important? Like, why is this an issue if all the stress is impacting our sleep? Why does that matter? Like, why is sleep so important for us?
Sure. I think we can think about it in two ways. One is, what are the immediate effects of a bad night of sleep? And, obviously, when people don't sleep well, the next day they're tired, they have trouble concentrating, they're irritable. And so part of it is just how people feel the next day because they're not getting enough sleep. Then there's the other side is kind of the long-term consequences, which we know that kind of chronically not getting enough sleep just is not great for our physical and mental health. And so it has wear and tear on the body over time.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those things that if you get a bad night of sleep or a few kind of nights of poor sleep, you can kind of feel effects pretty quickly. And then, like you said, over time, that cumulative effect is not great. So, what are some healthy sleep habits? And, because I think that sometimes the whole concept of getting good sleep, it can kind of feel a bit opaque, right? Like some people are able to just sleep well. They never have a problem. And then other people have a problem and, everyone's trying to maybe tinker and figure out what it is. It's impacting their sleep. So, so what are some healthy sleep habits that you would recommend to people, things that they actually can control?
Sure. So I think one of the first foundations of a good night of sleep is just regularity. And so, our bodies like routine and regularity. So one of the most basic things we can do is just try to follow a regular schedule. So try to go to bed at a relatively consistent time of night. Try to wake up at a consistent time morning. It doesn't have to be, exactly the same time every day. But some relative consistency is always good. That's kind of one foundation. And of course, as part of that, it means spending an adequate amount of time in bed. So sometimes people tell me, well, I'm only getting 6.5 hours of sleep per night. But then I ask them, how much time are they spending in bed? And they say, well, 6 hours and 45 minutes. So they're actually sleeping fine. It's just they're not having enough time in bed. So giving yourself ample opportunity to get a good night of sleep. Another important component is making sure we have ample time for kind of relaxing and winding down at night, making sure kind of physically and mentally we're in a good state. We've had a chance to kind of shed the tensions and the activities of the day to allow us to get some sleep at night. And I guess the last thing I'll say at this point is just thinking not just about what's happening at night, but what's going on during the day. I always say that the way we sleep at night is a reflection of our day. And so kind of the more if our days are stressful, if we're drinking caffeine all day, if we're inactive during the day, all those things that are going on during the day then have the potential to impact our ability to sleep at night. So really thinking about it as kind of a 24-hour-a-day pattern that we want to establish.
Yeah, and that leads into my next question, and you kind of mentioned one, like drinking caffeine all day. But are there things that people don't realize they do that actually
Mm,
negatively impact sleep that we should kind of be looking out for? Like we don't realize we're kind of like, setting ourselves up
mm.
a few yards behind the starting point.
Yeah, I think the caffeine's a good place to start with that one. I mean, everyone is aware of the fact that caffeine is a stimulant, and that's one of the main reasons we consume it. What people often don't realize, though, is that caffeine can remain in the brain for up to 8 to 10 hours. So a cup of coffee at 3 in the afternoon can still affect our ability to fall asleep at 11 o'clock that night. So I generally advise against, or just kind of minimize caffeine after lunchtime, essentially. So I think that's one habit that is often misunderstood. Another common one is alcohol. Alcohol, of course, is the opposite of caffeine. It's a sedative. And it's actually one of the most common things that people use to self-medicate for sleep problems. And indeed, with alcohol in our system, we do tend to fall asleep faster. But as our body metabolizes alcohol, it breaks it down into some chemicals that keep us at a very shallow, poor quality sleep. So alcohol-induced sleep is generally not very refreshing. So the alcohol ends up being counterproductive. And I guess the kind of one other one that comes to mind is that people often think, well, if I'm having trouble sleeping, I should spend more time in bed. I should get into bed extra early. But then they end up getting into bed at a time of night that they're just not ready for bed. They don't feel sleepy yet. And it's really important to not get into bed unless you actually think you're going to be able to sleep. So waiting until you feel like your body and mind are ready to get into sleep. So those are a few that come to mind.
Yeah, one of the things, I've heard from people also, it seems like a healthy habit is like, working out. But like if they work out, if they like take their Peloton class at 8 o'clock at night, and they can find that it's hard to sleep later, what would you
Yeah,
say to that?
yeah, that's a great point. That yes, regular exercise during the day is good for sleep. But what happens is normally our core body temperature drops at night. And as our body cools, that helps us to feel sleepy. Well, any kind of aerobic exercises elevates your core temperature, but it keeps it elevated for a couple of hours. And
Hmm.
so you're absolutely right. Aerobic exercise close to bedtime elevates that not blood pressure, body temperature, and can make it hard to fall asleep. So I generally suggest avoiding kind of vigorous exercise within a couple of hours or so of bedtime.
Very helpful. And you mentioned like, winding down. Are there like some specific things that you've like, you've seen in the literature that people
Mhm.
find to be helpful winding down? Is it like sleep stories or, listening to, I don't know, music or reading? Like, what do you recommend for kind of winding down that the general population finds to be helpful?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with each individual finding what is relaxing for them, because
Mhm.
sometimes what's relaxing for one person is stimulating for another. But some common things are indeed listening to music, watching TV, but relaxing TV. So generally, no news before bed is a good idea. Um, some relaxation exercises, doing some deep breathing, those sorts of things. And even people often ask me, like, well, what about like a cup of herbal tea before bed, or a scented candle or something? And I always say, like, experiment with different things and find what works well for you, but then to make it part of your routine. Again, this idea of routines, that if there's a certain activity you're going to do before bed each night, do it regularly, because then that's going to start to signal to your brain, oh, it's time to go to bed. And I think the only other thing I'd add is, particularly for people who tend to do a lot of thinking in bed, which is a lot of people. A lot of people tell me I could sleep fine if I could just shut my mind off at night. What can be really helpful is a little while before bed is to do a writing exercise, to take out a piece of paper and just start to write down all the thoughts of the day. It might be thinking about something that happened earlier that day. Maybe it's thinking about all the things you need to get done tomorrow, something you're stressed out about. Kind of doesn't matter, but the idea is you're kind of helping to use that writing to clear those thoughts out of your mind. And a lot of people find that when they do that, it helps to calm the mind, and they're less likely to be thinking about those things when they're lying in bed at night. So those are a few thoughts in terms of winding down activities.
Yeah, it's almost like kind of like a brain purge, getting some of that, that's been rattling around in your mind out. And there is something significant to that, like when you can kind of, do something, physical or action based with all the thoughts, that are going around in your mind. And, as an anxiety specialist, I tell people, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you start to find that worrying, really practicing planned worrying and saying, all right, I can't fix this problem at 4 a.m, but like tomorrow at 8, I can pick this back up. But kind of realizing that there is something about the brain wanting to focus on things that it can't do anything about in the middle of the night.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah.
And I was just going to add to that. And I always say, no one ever tells me they lie in bed tossing and turning in the middle of the night, thinking happy, wonderful thoughts.
Right.
Yeah, we just seem to that's when we do our worrying, our rumination. So I totally agree with you. Kind of putting those things off till the next day is a much better option.
Mm-hmm. And, say that that's one way to handle if you wake up in the middle of the night, but what are some other things that you would suggest for people who, maybe they say, I have no trouble falling asleep, but I'm waking up in the middle of the night and then I'm really finding it hard to go back to sleep, and, say that they focus on planned worrying and they have some other things, but what else would you kind of suggest for them to do?
Yeah. When we wake up in the middle of the night, usually we have maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes or so that our body's relatively calm and relaxed. Our mind is relatively calm and relaxed. And hopefully we're going to fall back to sleep. But if we're not falling back to sleep, we reach this point where we start thinking about the fact that we haven't fallen back to sleep yet. And once you start thinking about your sleep, it typically starts this kind of spiral of thinking more and more about sleep, getting more and more frustrated or anxious about not being able to sleep, trying harder and harder to get to sleep. And the longer we lie there tossing and turning, we actually get further and further from sleep instead of closer and closer. So one of the most important things when you start to get to that point is to actually take a break. Is that if you really feel yourself like thinking and focusing on your sleep, is to get up, ideally go to a whole nother room and sit in a comfortable spot and do something relaxing. Maybe coming back to some of those relaxing at pre-bed activities. Allow your body and your mind a chance to settle back down. And then once you feel sleepy, return to bed. I often say that just lying in bed, tossing and turning adds fuel to the fire and just makes it worse. So getting out of bed, you're actually going to tend to fall asleep faster than if you just remain in bed.
Very helpful. And, there are a lot of different thoughts on this, but what are your you said do something relaxing, and then you had mentioned with winding down, like relaxing TV is okay. What are your thoughts on like screen use?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's two issues with screens before bed. One is the content of what we're doing, whether it's the TV, the computer, the phone. A lot of the activities we tend to go to, especially with our phone, actually can be quite stimulating, whether it's scrolling through social media or watching videos. So you have to think carefully about, is what I'm doing actually relaxing or not? Or is it stimulating? The second component is the light exposure. The worst type of light for our sleep is blue light. And it turns out, not on purpose, but that the screens for cell phones, computers, tablets, all those sorts of things, they give off more blue light than any other color. So especially when we've got our phone 6 inches from our eyes, we get blasted with that blue light. It affects our sleep, it stimulates the brain, and can make it harder to sleep. So in an ideal world, I would prefer people not to be on their phones or devices for an hour before bed. That's a tough sell for a lot of people. So at a minimum, making sure it's relaxing, content, and pretty much every phone these days in the display settings has the ability to filter out blue light. And so, for example, in the Apple operating system, it's called night shift. So you can go in and you can say, if your bedtime's 10:30, you can set it so that after 9 or 9:30, it's starting to filter out blue light until the morning. So absolutely, the screens are an issue. The TV, I don't worry as much about because most people don't sit this far from the TV. Usually the TV's across the room. So that's going to be less of an issue.
Yeah, well, I didn't even know about the night shift mode. That's great. That so there is something you can do. Because like you said, many of us even read on our phones, and then, we don't need to have another light on. So it takes off one step. And so it can make the process to sleep even smoother. But like you said, then you're up against the blue light impacting that. So that might be a decent compromise.
Yeah.
One of the other things, that people are always wondering about, can I take naps? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I feel like napping has gotten a bad reputation, and it's almost like this sense of like, if you nap during the day, you're somehow a bad person or something's wrong with you. I often say that napping during the day is like snacking between meals. If you have a big snack, by the time you get to your next meal, you're just not going to be so hungry. Napping's the same way. Long naps during the day, it's like robbing you of your appetite for sleep. So you're less likely to be sleepy that night. And that can contribute to difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep. However, a light snack between meals is usually not going to be a problem. And in the same way, a short nap can be okay. There's more and more evidence of this idea of kind of a power nap, 15 to 20, maybe 30 minutes max, being enough to give us a boost in our alertness for the rest of the day, but short enough that it is not likely to interfere with our ability to sleep at night. So napping can be okay as long as it's kept to a brief nap, which might mean setting an alarm to make sure it does not become an hour nap or an hour and a half or something like that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think, I think people get nervous, like you said, like, oh no, is this going to impact my sleep at night? And it seems like if you keep it boundaried and contained, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But again, a 2-hour nap and then you wake up groggy and then you can't sleep, that's not going to do anyone any favors.
Exactly.
All right. So, how do you know that your sleep is suffering? Because, and I guess my question here is, so some people are like, I'm just like a big sleeper. I need 9 to 10 hours a night. And other people are like, I can survive on, 6 hours. Like, what's the optimum amount of sleep? And and does it differ for different people?
Yeah, certainly. You often hear this like 8 hours per night is what we're supposed to get. And that does seem to be kind of a good target for most people. That's kind of optimal for most people. But you're right, it does vary from person to person. Some people need more sleep. Some people need less sleep. And so I think but the problem is we don't have any kind of like blood test or brain scan that we can do to say, you need 5 hours, you need 8 hours, you need 9 hours, or whatever it may be. So I think the key is to see how many hours it takes for you to feel really fully rested the next day. Like if you're by halfway through the day really dragging, then that's not enough sleep. And so kind of trying to increase the amount of sleep you're getting until you're feeling rested the next day. And that's, by the way, assuming you're getting decent quality sleep. Because if your sleep is poor quality for any of a variety of reasons, you may get 8 to 9 hours, but you still don't feel rested during the day because the quality of your sleep is so poor.
And the things that impact quality, you said, are like alcohol, maybe caffeine, adrenaline. What else what other things that we might be missing?
Well, it can even be stress. So what we know is that when people are stressed, obviously that can make it hard to fall asleep. But even once you fall asleep, that stress or tension or anxiety follows you into sleep and actually can disrupt the quality of the sleep that you're getting. Poor sleep quality, especially when it's been going on for kind of a chronic basis, is also something we start to think about, like, well, are there diagnosable sleep disorders going on as well?
Gotcha. That's helpful. And if someone's really feeling like they don't understand why, like they're feeling so tired, or they're getting like they feel like their sleep is being impacted, or the quality of their sleep is being impacted, they should talk to their doctor and potentially get a sleep study.
Yes, definitely. I think they should. Anytime you're just sleeping poorly, despite spending enough time in bed, because again, like if you're just not spending enough time in bed, you don't, your doctor can't fix that. I mean, you need to actually have the time in bed. But if you're spending enough time in bed and you're just not getting the sleep that you need, and that's been going on for a few months or longer, it is a good idea to mention it to your healthcare providers, and they can see if a referral to the sleep center is a good idea.
Okay. And we know that people are, we all tend to be bad historians. We can think like, oh, like, maybe I never sleep. Would you recommend, if someone's curious about their, kind of their sleep, to start documenting like how many hours they are getting a night?
It's certainly not a bad idea. You can always, people can look online for what we call a sleep diary, where each morning they just answer a few questions about how they slept the night before, and they can look at their patterns over time. And sometimes when people start to track their sleep and really look at the numbers, they realize that the way they thought they were sleeping, it was not actually accurate, that the numbers start to tell a different story. So definitely that can be really eye-opening for a lot of people.
Okay. And what are your, thoughts? And I know some of these would have to be directed to one's medical doctor, but what are your thoughts on both like over the counter or prescribed sleep aids? Like, what should people do? I know CBD oil got pretty popular, and melatonin, and, and then there's things, like, what is it, Sinestra or Sonata, like things like that, that people are, get prescribed. So what would you suggest? How would you kind of maybe think about like over the counter sleep aids, and then one's prescribed by one's doctor?
So starting with the over the counter sleep aids, the overwhelming majority of them contain what's called diphenhydramine. It's an antihistamine, and it does tend to make people feel sleepy. The problem is they're kind of notorious for what we call hangover effects the next day. So people feel groggy, dry mouth, sometimes a headache the next day. So sometimes people do sleep better with them, but then they feel lousy the next morning. So that's kind of one of the biggest issues with a lot of the over-the-counter sleep aids. Melatonin, we know quite a bit about. It's a hormone that our brain produces at night that is involved in regulating our sleep. There's been quite a bit of research on melatonin, and actually most of it finds that melatonin is really no better than a placebo in helping us sleep better. And so the effects of melatonin are likely to be kind of modest at best. I get a lot of questions about CBD oil these days, and there's virtually no research. We actually have almost no data saying whether or not it's at all effective or not. So I can't really make any recommendations for that. As far as the prescription sleep medications go, there's quite a few of them out there, and when they work well, they work. People can really get a lot of benefit. The problem is they often don't work as well as we would like, and so they're only partially effective, or they can become less effective over time. And probably more importantly, they're not really addressing the underlying problem. And so generally medications are recommended only for short-term use, 2 weeks, maybe a month, but generally not for long term.
Yeah. Okay. So, it sounds like if you can try these other things that we've been talking about, and then it might be effective to get a sleep study if your sleep is continuing to suffer. And then, other things like sleep apnea could also be a factor that it might be good to get some information about too. So a sleep aid, again, might not be addressing the underlying issue if that were to be the case as well.
Exactly.
All right. And just my final question, I think, like, say you get a bad night of sleep, what do you do about it?
Yeah. I mean, this may seem counterintuitive, but nothing. Like, and what I mean by that is in most cases, sleep problems are self-correcting, meaning like, well, how do you feel after a bad night of sleep? You feel extra sleepy, so you're more likely to get a good night of sleep the next night, or the next night, or the next night. And the just to kind of accept, like, okay, I've had a bad night of sleep. I feel lousy today, but it's not the end of the world. I can get through the day. What ends up kind of happening oftentimes is the more we start becoming really focused on our sleep and getting back to sleep, and especially if we start getting anxious about it, well, then that actually feeds into the problem and makes our sleep worse and worse. So just kind of taking a step back and saying, it stinks that I had a bad night of sleep or a stretch of bad nights of sleep, but I can manage, and chances are it's a lot of the time it's just going to return to normal over time.
Yeah. And, because that's where I come into play on the anxiety side,
Exactly.
right? When people start catastrophizing about their sleep, then we have another problem. Then we've got anxiety about the sleep, and then you got to tackle both your sleep problem, now your anxiety. So try to kind of manage that thought. And I think reminding yourself of that, like they are, tend to be self-correcting, ride the wave, and not work yourself up about that so much. And I lied. I have one last question, because I think to the pandemic a little bit. So, with a lot of people with work from home, there's some more flexibility in their schedule. Do people have kind of different, I don't know if this is the right word, but sleep templates in the sense of like, some people are like, I'm a late nighter, I'm kind of nocturnal, I'd prefer like a 1 a.m. to 10 a.m. schedule or something like that. If people have the option to do that, like, is that a thing? And can they do that? Or is it always, then there's some like motivational speakers and people that are like, you should always be getting up at 5 a.m. with a cold shower, So what are your thoughts? Are people different? And would you recommend like go with what works for you?
Yeah, it's absolutely true that we all have kind of different timing of our sleep and our ideal sleep. Some people are more night owls, some people are more early birds, and we tend to get the best sleep when we go to bed at the time that our body prefers. Ironically, during the pandemic, there's a group of people who are sleeping a lot better than they usually do, because without having to like be up as early to commute to work, if they're working from home, they have more freedom to follow their body and sleep in sync with their body, and they're doing better. And so one of the lessons I'm hoping people take away from the pandemic is kind of realizing if they're one of those people who, when I follow this pattern, I actually do a lot better with my sleep. I'm hoping they find ways to keep that going, even post-pandemic. And so absolutely trying to understand what your body's natural rhythm is, and as much as you can, trying to follow it with your sleep.
That's super helpful. And I think, again, kind of one of the long-lasting changes that might be coming with the pandemic, especially for work from home. I personally am enjoying having a little bit of a slower morning these days, like kind of getting up and getting out of the house like a cannonball to catch your train and do all of that. There is something that's a little bit nicer about following that. So hopefully that's a positive that we can see from all of this. But thank you so much. All these were super helpful tips. And anybody who's watching this and is having some trouble, you can, go on to Penn Cobalt. You can have one of our psychotherapists even help you practice these things and be accountable to them. And we also have resources on there to help with sleep and healthy sleep habits. So thank you so much, Dr. Gehrman.
My pleasure.